So, I went to see Beau is Afraid last night, and I wasn't planning on covering it at all, but I need to talk about it because it happened to me, and if I don't, my brain is going to catch fire. Ari Aster, writer-director of 2018's Hereditary and 2019's Midsommar, has become one of my favorite directors of recent years. I think both Hereditary and Midsommar are all-time great horror films that are really at the front line of this recent horror renaissance we've been seeing over the past few years. I say horror, and that's definitely true. There's scary stuff that happens in Hereditary and Midsommar, but I don't think either movie is super scary in a traditional sense. Well, the last 15 minutes of Hereditary are scary in a traditional sense, but most of that movie is really a family drama about loss with supernatural goings-on in the background, until all hell breaks loose. Midsommar doesn't have many moments that are at all traditionally scary. What makes Hereditary and Midsommar so powerful, and what has made Ari Aster a force to be reckoned with, is the way these movies are not so much scary as they are emotionally devastating. Both Hereditary and Midsommar have scenes that are absolutely painful to watch. They make me want to crawl out of my skin because of how uncomfortable they are. I won't spoil what happens in Hereditary because it happens in the middle of the movie, but there is a scene where you watch someone in a profound, almost comatose state of pain, of guilt, and of loss. It's hard to watch. Hard to watch this family going through what they're going through. At the beginning of Midsommar, we watch the main character, Dani, lose her entire family in the worst way imaginable, and it puts you in that moment and asks you to stay there a while, forces you to sit there and watch this character go through the worst moment of her life. Ari Aster is clearly a fan of having actors ugly cry on camera. There are scenes in Hereditary where you see Toni Collette absolutely lose it in a way crying in movies never looks. There are scenes in Midsommar where you see Florence Pugh crying and wailing and screaming in an almost biblical rending of clothes level of mourning. It is deeply uncomfortable and unpleasant to watch someone grieve in this way, and the movie hangs on it because it puts you off balance and makes you more susceptible to the scares yet to come. Hereditary and Midsommar are both very traditional narratives, however. You can leave both movies with a sense that perhaps not everything you were seeing was really happening, or that there was more going on than was depicted, but at the end of the day, Hereditary and Midsommar are not hard to understand on a literal level. You don't need to dig into what Hereditary is saying about the fear of carrying mental illness in your genes, or what Midsommar is saying about the way cults brainwash people with love to understand what happened in the movie. It is a series of literal events happening in sequential order. Beau is Afraid is not like that. Beau is Afraid is not a traditional narrative. I don't think anything that you see in Beau is Afraid should be taken literally at all. So I'm talking around the question you probably came to this video with. Did I like the movie? Yeah, I think so. It was certainly an experience, and I'm not sure I want to watch it again anytime soon, but I'm glad I saw it. Regardless of how I feel about it, I'm confident that a lot of people are going to hate this movie, this 3-hour episode of Tim and Eric's Bedtime Stories, especially if they went into it expecting something like Ari Aster's other work. Beau is Afraid, despite the title, isn't a horror movie. Not just in the way I'd say I don't think Midsommar is particularly scary, but in the sense that it's not shot or presented or written like one at all. Beau is Afraid is, on paper, and this might be a spoiler for the setup of the movie if you really want to go in completely blind, although if you want to go in completely blind, I'm not sure why you clicked on a YouTube video about the movie. It's about a man named Beau, played by Joaquin Phoenix, going on an Odyssey-style adventure to try to make it from his apartment in the city to his hometown to attend his mother's funeral. The world Beau lives in is frightening, violent, and oppressive. Beau lives with unspecified but severe anxiety disorders that have essentially infantilized him to the point where he's unable to function as a human being. He can't work, he can't be social, he can't really do anything. His apartment is his one safe haven in a world that terrifies him, and the only time we see him willingly leave that apartment is to attend his therapy appointment at the very beginning of the film, and to begin to leave to try to catch his flight home a few minutes later before disaster strikes. Generally speaking, I think there are two levels most stories operate on: the literal and the metaphorical. What's happening in the story and what the story is saying. I think generally my favorite works have to operate well on both levels. When something fails to operate on the literal level, you get something that can feel confusing. There are so many weird, trippy endings that seem to come out of nowhere. Take your pick for one of these. I don't know, BioShock Infinite. I get what the game was trying to say about the illusion of choice in games, and even what implications the existence of a multiverse would have on free will itself, but the ending fails so hard to work on a literal level because what is literally happening makes so little literal sense that I think it ultimately fails as an ending. On the other hand, you have films which work just fine on a literal level, but don't consider what the implications of their story are if you abstract them at all. Take, for example, Disney's Zootopia. A fine film if you don't think about it at all, but as soon as you start laying out what the message of the movie actually is, oops, they imply racism is justified. The best stories, whether that's in games, movies, literature, or whatever else, work well on both levels. I'd use something like Everything Everywhere All at Once as an example of this. What's interesting about Beau is Afraid is that it doesn't feel especially concerned with operating on either level to me, and that's kind of unique. I don't think we're meant to see Beau walking through a neighborhood so brutal and crime-ridden that dead bodies are left on the street to rot for days as literal. Rather, this is how Beau sees his world. At the same time, what is allegorically happening to Beau also doesn't really feel like the point to me. If I try to read into what is happening on a metaphorical level, then it's not hard to see the entire film, or at least large swaths of it, as anti-medication, which I certainly hope wasn't the point. What I see Beau is Afraid as is ultimately a tool for empathy. The movie is a collection of anxieties and distortions of the world through that lens. I'm speaking here as someone who suffers from a fairly severe anxiety disorder myself, though certainly not as bad as Beau does. There are moments in this movie which represent anxieties I've never seen put to screen, but which I recognize. There are moments which are darkly funny in the film because anxiety, as oppressive as it is often darkly funny. I want to give an example from very early on in the film. Beau is told at the beginning of the film to make sure he always takes his new medication with water, every single time. Very early on in the film, he pops one of these pills into his mouth, only to notice his water bottle is empty. Something relatable, something I've done before. He goes to the bathroom sink and turns it on. No water comes out. He goes to the kitchen sink. Nothing. He goes to the bathtub. No water. At this point, the pill has dissolved in his mouth, he gags, and swallows what's left. What happens if you take this drug without water? Beau types into Google. The top result? In memoriam. This person took it without water just once and died. In a panic, Beau needs to go get water now. He sees a pallet of water bottles across the street in the front window of a store, but the street is filled with people stabbing each other, fighting each other, even a serial killer the news has called the birthday boy stab boy, or something along those lines, in broad daylight walking down the street. At this point, Beau has lost his apartment keys, and so getting across the street, buying water, and then getting back will require him to leave his apartment unlocked and the front door propped open for just a minute. He does so, sprints across the street to the safety of the store as homeless people chase him from one side of the street to the other. He grabs a bottle of water and downs it. Then he goes to the cash register. He owes $1.75. His credit card is declined. He looks across the street. One of the people who scares him in the streets has noticed the building is unlocked. The clerk runs the card again. Declined. Several people have entered the building now. The clerk starts screaming at Beau that he's going to call the police over this $1.75 bottle of water. Beau starts rifling through his wallet, looking for the money. The clerk is screaming at him. He finds $1. The clerk is screaming. Hundreds of strangers are now filing into Beau's building. He sees the light in his apartment turn on. He throws some change on the counter and sprints for the exit as the clerk picks up the phone and screams at him. As Beau reaches the door to his building, the last person from the streets to enter pulls the phone book that was propping the door open. Beau is locked out. The crowd filing into the elevator stares at him. Beau's apartment is completely destroyed in the next scene, as hundreds of people destroy it with sex and violence, and at least one man is killed during it. Now, this scene is very funny. It's very funny to watch the smallest of mistakes, taking a pill without checking your water bottle, spin out of control into this nightmare scenario. Are we to take this scene as literal, though? I don't think so. I think what the movie is doing here is attempting to show the world through Beau's lens. Anxiety disorders, or at least my own, often cause a lot of worst-case scenario thinking. In every situation, you fixate on what the worst possible thing that could happen is. And when you say these things out loud, they often do sound ridiculous. That doesn't make the fear of them happening less real. Would leaving your apartment unlocked for all of 5 minutes result in the complete destruction of everything you own by hundreds of violent, unhinged strangers? Probably not, but that's what Beau thinks would happen. And in this strange world, what Beau thinks would happen is what happens every time. There have been moments in my life where my anxiety disorder has been so out of control that even crossing the street to go into a drugstore felt scary and dangerous and paralyzing, the same way we see it feel for Beau here. Thankfully, I'm in a better place now, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't recognize this feeling, this emotion that is being put to screen here. Now, I've never been as completely paralyzed by anxiety as Beau is, and very few people in real life are, but this isn't real life. This is a movie, so it doesn't need to be an example of what real anxiety is like. It needs to be an example of what real anxiety feels like. This is one example, but the entire movie is a tour of worst-case scenarios to a comical extreme. The movie plays with the anxiety of putting someone else out, being a burden or a nuisance to someone else through no fault of your own. The anxiety of paranoia. The anxiety that you are grieving incorrectly, that you aren't being respectful to a loved one you've lost. The dread that something you don't know about is coming for you. A generalized fear you can't put your finger on. The inner battle between the voice of your guilt and the true justification of your actions, with the voice of guilt being booming and overpowering, and the defense being a much smaller, quieter voice. I don't feel like this movie is working as some larger metaphor for saying something about these anxieties. I feel like this movie is about empathy. Not empathy from Beau or empathy for Beau from the other characters, but instilling empathy in the audience for what this sort of crippling, overwhelming anxiety is like. In that way, I think this is the most Ari Aster movie yet. Ari Aster's movies are all about making you feel what the characters feel. Hereditary made you feel the grief the characters were going through. Midsommar is about representing the overwhelming pain of a bad breakup. This movie, Beau is Afraid, looks the way anxiety feels. That is remarkable.